Good evening, everybody. I'm hoping that you can see and indeed hear me on your screens. I think I'm probably appearing as a little postage stamp video in the corner, so I hope I'm there. It's wonderful not to see you exactly, but to at least know you are all there. I'm Rowley Keating. I'm Chief Executive of the British Library. I'm delighted to say that this virtual event, I'm speaking to you from the British Library. It's a little quiet here, but it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to welcome British Library supporters and friends from all over the UK, and I think indeed all over the world, to this evening where we're looking at the treasures of the British Library. It's the latest of our, I'm not quite sure what we call them, online events, webinars, special talks for our friends and supporters. And I don't need to tell you, these are incredibly odd and difficult times for the British Library, as for all of you living your lives, running your businesses. We here are very pleased and proud to have opened now the majority of our reading rooms, be it on a pre-booked limited basis, and our galleries, most of our galleries, including very relevant tonight, the wonderful Sir John Ripblatt Gallery for the treasures of British Library. But we do have a long, long way to go. Normality feels a very long way off for all of us, doesn't it? And we couldn't be doing any of this without the support we receive from you, from our patrons, our supporters, and our friends. We are a charity, and we really do rely on and value your support. So there are many, many ways to get involved with us. So if you are at all inspired by what you hear and see tonight, please do contact me or the development team. In terms of what you will see and hear tonight, I'm delighted that our guest speaker is my esteemed colleague Julian Harrison, who is our lead curator for medieval, historical and literary manuscripts, better known perhaps to many of us as the curator or one of the curatorial team on our Magna Carta exhibition, and lead curator on our exhibition Harry Potter, History of Magic. But I have to say, more maybe on a more personal note, for me, I think just simply one of the great experts and enthusiasts for the British Library collection as a whole. So to talk about this evening, the treasures of the British Library, you could not be in safer hands or better company. So it is my pleasure to hand over to our speaker for this evening, Julian Harrison. Over to you, Julian.
So thank you very much, Rowley, for that very kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the development team here at the British Library for kindly inviting me to give this talk tonight. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes. And at the end, myself and my colleague Harriet from the development team are going to be able to answer some of your questions. So if you would like to ask questions during this webinar, we're going to suggest that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We might not be able to answer every question at the end, but we're going to make a commitment that if we are unable to answer your question, we'll try and follow up with you offline. So can I have a first slide, please? So what is the British Library's Treasures Gallery, and what is our permanent offer at St Pancras? Now, you probably know that the British Library has a huge number of collection items in its care. People often question how many items the British Library has, but the figure goes up to, sometimes estimates range up to 200 million different items. We of course hold the National Sound Archive, the National Newspaper Collection, the National Philatelic Collection, alongside all the books and manuscripts and other items in our collection. So when it comes to putting them on public display in our galleries and St Pancras, we have to make some very hard and very selective decisions as to what we show. And we also have to think very carefully about our audiences. So of course, the library's reading rooms and our online offer caters predominantly for our researchers. But of course, in the actual Sir John Ricklatt Treasures of the British Library Gallery, we have a very high percentage of groups that feature school children and families and the general public and our international audiences. So we like to think of it as a way that we can engage more particularly with a larger range of the public and different types of audience. And we can tell them stories about our collection items, the histories behind them. And today, my talk is going to be particularly focused on some of those hidden histories of the British Library. Can I have a next slide, please? I thought I'd start as well by just giving you a feeling for the kinds of items that we currently have on display in the Treasures Gallery. And that's in particular for those of you who may have come to the gallery in recent years or may be unfamiliar with our offering. So at present, the gallery is arranged in a number of sections, and one of them, one first and foremost, is devoted to sacred texts. And the item that you can see on your screen here is known as Sultan Barbiar's Quran. It was made in around the year 1304 in Cairo. It's one volume that is on display of a 7-volume manuscript of the Quran, and it's handwritten in gold. And we have other sections of the sacred text display devoted to the other great world faiths and religions, including Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and so forth. Can I have the next slide, please? Another section of the Treasures Gallery is devoted to our maps and views. And I put this slide up to show you that we have a real global focus on our collections. The item that you can see on your screen here is a porcelain chart dating from the 16th century. And that shows Europe, and it shows the north coast of Africa, shows the British Isles in the top corner. Our collections are truly universal. We have items in several hundred languages and in a range of different formats. Can I have the next slide, please? And we also have a section of the gallery which is devoted to literature. And that enables us to display and to engage with our visitors, not just with our printed books, but also with our handwritten manuscripts. And I'm going to come back and tell you some of those stories later, but I would say that in particular, as I'm a curator of medieval manuscripts, I always find it fascinating when people encounter a handwritten text for the first time. They often discover that the handwritten version could often be different to the version that makes it into print. It might feature the author's annotations and corrections and emendations, and you can actually see the author or perhaps the scribe of a manuscript at work. And can I have the next slide, please? And we also have part of the gallery at the moment devoted to the art of the book. And this is where we display a number of items which are unique, and they are of exceptionally high cultural value. So they may contain items such as the Javanese manuscripts, which are shown in this slide here, and including some of our great medieval illuminated treasures, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Sherborne Missal. And there are other sections of our gallery devoted to subjects such as printing, to science, to music, and also to the British Library's historical documents. And for the rest of my talk, I'm going to take you through some of my favourite items that we have on display. And as we go through them, I'm going to touch on some of the things which make them most interesting to me and which you may not usually get a glance or a glimpse of when you actually tour the gallery at the British Library. So, can I have the next slide, please? So, as Rowley noted at the beginning of his talk, I was one of the curators for the British Library's Magna Carta exhibition in 2015, which marked the 800th anniversary of the first time that Magna Carta was issued by King John in 1215. Now, you might ask, is Magna Carta unique to the British Library? And of course, the answer is no, because there is more than one copy of Magna Carta. Indeed, of the medieval issues and reissues of Magna Carta, there are approximately 20 different versions in manuscript, which are kept primarily in libraries in the United Kingdom and also in the United States of America at the National Archives and also in Australia. There are, though, only 4 of the surviving copies of Magna Carta as issued by King John in 1215, and we at the British Library are proud to hold 2 of those manuscripts, and the other 2 are held at Lincoln Cathedral and at Salisbury Cathedral, respectively. But what is actually unique about the British Library's own offering? Well, alongside Magna Carta, which you can see on our screen here, that's a document which has a red background. The item next to it is actually really interesting in its own right. It's the papal bull by which Pope Innocent III actually annulled Magna Carta within 10 weeks of it being issued in 1215. What people often don't realise, what people often don't understand, is that both King John and the Pope hated Magna Carta, and behind the backs of the barons, King John wrote to his friend the Pope and asked the Pope to have it annulled on the grounds that it had been forced upon him. And the Pope declared Magna Carta to be null and void. And there is only one unique manuscript of the papal bull which annuls Magna Carta, and that is held at the British Library and is on display in the Treasures Gallery today. And there are a couple of other little tidbits that you might want to know about the document itself. One of the Magna Carta manuscripts, which is held at the British Library, was badly damaged in a fire in 1731, but the one that you can see on your screen, we understand, was discovered in a London tailor shop in around 1630. And that always fascinates people. Why on earth would a document be found in a tailor shop? Well, a tailor would have required parchment to have lined the collars of gentlemen. And so that document was probably sitting in a pile in that particular shop so that it would have been cut up and used precisely for that purpose. And if it hadn't been found and presented to Sir Robert Cotton and then through his descent to the British Library, that document would have been obliterated and we wouldn't have it today. There's also something rather curious about this particular document, this particular copy of Magna Carta. The scribe, when he copied it out, he actually missed out one of the clauses, and so uniquely he added that line as a footnote at the bottom of the document. And also there are 3 slits in the parchment at the bottom of the page. It was once alleged that those are made by King John in a fit of rage, who attacked the manuscript with a dagger and stabbed it. Sadly, we think that's not likely to be the case. Instead, we believe that is where the royal seals and the seals of the barons would have been attached to the document. Can I have us next slide, please? So I want to talk very briefly about Shakespeare's First Folio. And some of you may have come to another talk in the series given by my colleague, Adrian Edwards, who is one of the library's Shakespeare experts. I just wanted to focus very briefly on the printing of the First Folio. It's one of the most famous books in history. There are several hundred copies of it surviving, a number of which are held at the British Library. Shakespeare, of course, died in 1616, but the First Folio wasn't printed until 7 years after his death in 1623. But what still fascinates me is that the First Folio is our primary witness for the survival of many of the most famous Shakespearean plays. Some of them had been printed in his own lifetime, but others we find for the first time printed in the first folio, and they include such seminal texts, seminal plays as Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, and The Tempest. So without the first folio, we probably wouldn't know or have the text of some of Shakespeare's greatest plays. Can I have a next slide, please? But this is another Shakespearean play. You might not be familiar with this one. This is the so-called Book of Thomas More. And the reason why you might not have heard about it is that Shakespeare is believed to have been just one of several collaborators upon this particular play. It was written in the 1590s. The handwritten copy survives at the British Library, and one of the scenes in particular is in a style of handwriting and in a style of language which scholars starting in the 19th century suddenly realised was very Shakespearean in its tone. And it's now believed by most Shakespearean scholars that this is actually in the handwriting of William Shakespeare himself. And indeed, if that's the case, this is the only surviving Shakespearean play script in existence. Now, sadly, we can't have this on permanent display in our galleries. It's very susceptible to light. So for conservation reasons, it's not often on show in the Treasures Gallery, but it was on display in our Shakespeare exhibition in 2016. And it has recently been digitized, so you can view it online on the library's digitized manuscript site. Can I have a next slide, please? I mentioned earlier that we have a section of the gallery devoted to sacred texts, and this is one of the most important Christian sacred texts. This is the so-called Codex Sinaiticus. It's actually one of the oldest Bibles in the world, dates back to the 4th century, and it's extraordinarily important because it is one of the oldest complete Bibles. It preserves the whole of the text of the New Testament. It's written in what we now know as codex or book form, and it rather than the former roll form as books were transmitted in late antiquity. So it really marks a really important stage in the development of the book. I'd also say that this manuscript is rather important. When you go and see it on display at the moment, we display it in the context of the creation of the Bible written in Greek. We explain how it's divided into books of the Bible and how it's written in 4 columns. But what I personally find really interesting is the fact that the British Library bought this manuscript in 1933 from the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. The British Museum, as it then was, paid £100,000 for this manuscript, and you can see on the screen that's as it arrived at the British Museum in the 1930s. £100,000 because Stalin needed the hard currency, and over 50% of the money to pay for this incredible artifact was raised through public subscription. And there are still leaves of this Bible surviving, not only at the British Library today, but also in Leipzig in Germany and in St. Petersburg, and also in Mount Sinai in Egypt. Can I have the next slide, please? I just wanted to touch on some of the other treasures that you may sometimes see in the Treasures Gallery at the British Library. So on the left here, you have one of our greatest Chinese manuscripts. This is the so-called Dunhuang star chart. It was made around the year 700, and it was discovered in a cave in Dunhuang in central China around about the year 1900, together with a treasure trove of about 40,000 other Buddhist scrolls and manuscripts. This is the oldest surviving atlas of the night sky, and it records approximately 1,300 different stars in the sky. And it's an incredible achievement because all those stars would have been observed before the days of the invention of the telescope. It's one of my favourite objects at the British Library. And on the right, we have another incredible artifact. This is one of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. This is the so-called Codex Arundel. It was on display in our Leonardo da Vinci exhibition last year. And on the screen here, you see Leonardo's diagram for the invention of an underwater breathing apparatus. And we're very fortunate. Actually, this particular notebook was disbound in recent times. And that actually means that we can rotate the pages which are displayed in the gallery, and we can potentially display more than one page of a notebook at any given time. Can I have the next slide, please? But of course, we don't just have ancient and medieval and early modern objects on display in our treasures gallery. One of my favourite displays is devoted to the Beatles, and we have some of their own handwritten lyrics of some of their most famous songs. So, for example, the lyrics to Yesterday are on display sometimes in the galleries at the British Library. Some of those items are on loan to the library, and some of them have been recently acquired by us. And in future times, I'm very hopeful that with the onset of new technology and technological advances, we'll be able to show and display more sound in our gallery. We are, of course, National Sound Archive, and it would be fabulous, wouldn't it, to be able to have more sound and more video. We know, of course, that some of the Beatles' own videos, Strawberry Fields and others, are some of the greatest early, most innovative pop videos, and it'd be great to be able to display those alongside some of their handwritten lyrics, showing how the actual, from the beginning of a song to its artistic performance, and how it's received by the general public. Can I have the next slide, please? We also have a number of items on display which relate to items and episodes in history which people might say are rather contentious. And I think that's actually very important as an institution, that we don't shy away from stories from the past that have disappointing or contentious or even catastrophic outcomes. We should review how they happened. We should, as historians, explain how they happened. The item that I'm showing you here is the printed edition, the first printed edition of the letters of the late Ignatius Sancho, an African, including memoirs of his life. And Ignatius Sancho was born around the year 1729, and he was brought to England as an orphan. He was brought up in the Montague family, and he later gained fame as a composer and as a writer. But of course, I've left out an important part of his life history there, because he was, of course, born on a slave trading ship. And in his later life, he wrote a series of letters and corresponded with some of the greatest figures of his time, people like Lawrence Sterne. And in the letters as presented in this collection, he talks about some of the most famous events of his day, including the Gordon riots of 1780, and of course, his experiences of being brought up as a slave. Can I have the next slide, please? And it may not have escaped some of your notice and attention that 2020 marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. And we have many of her letters and associated diagrams and scientific treatises kept in the British Library's collections. We have recently made a great intention to display far more items in the Treasures Gallery which were written by, or were written for, or were read by female authors and owners and protagonists. And Florence Nightingale, we're proud to say, is one of those. And the letter that you have on the screen here is very famous and very important. In 1854, Florence Nightingale was sent to the Crimea to look after the British troops, and she wrote this letter in 1855 to Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of State for War, and in that she explains that her measures for helping the health and sanitation of the British troops in the field hospitals there have been a success. At one stage, 52% of the casualties were actually dying afterwards of diseases that they were picking up in the field hospitals. But she does also write to him and say that there is still a desperate need for trained nurses, in her words, trained nurses to be sent to the Crimea, and not, again, in her own words, fat, drunken, old dames. So it's a real insight into the thinking of this great historical and medical pioneer, and we're very proud to have this item and others relating to it on display in our Treasures Gallery. Can I have the final slide, please? And I just wanted to bring us up to the present day. Now, last year, 2019, the British Library was very, very proud to receive into its collections the archive of the great writer Andrea Levy. She died sadly of cancer last year, but she made provision with her husband that her papers, her notebooks, her sound recordings will be passed to the British Library. And that is indeed what has happened. And those items will be catalogued, and then they will subsequently be able to be issued in our reading rooms. They will be digitized. They'll be made available to researchers through our reading rooms and through our sound studios. Some of those items include her notebooks for Small Island, which won the Orange Prize for Literature in 1984, and her handwritten plays, and for example, her notes about a play relating to Mary Seacole, who was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale. Now, the British Library has a continuing commitment to acquire the papers and archives of leading politicians and scientists and literary figures, and we can often only do that with the support of our patrons and benefactors. So we are indeed extraordinarily grateful to all of our patrons and to everybody and to the general public who are able to provide us with both financial support and also other forms of support to help us in these acquisitions. So that brings me to the end of my presentation today. I should remind you that now is probably a good opportunity. We see that some questions are already coming into our mailbox. We're going to spend a few more minutes at the end of this talk, and we will try and answer as many of your questions as possible now. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening to me this evening, and I hope that you continue to support us at the British Library, and also that we see you back very soon. In fact, it has just occurred to me that there was indeed one more slide. Can I have the next slide, please? I should have mentioned, of course, that we are still open again to the general public. We opened our Treasures Gallery on the 1st of September. Should mention that we have put in social distancing measures. So please, if you are able to come to London, do book your tickets in advance. Of course, entry to the library's Treasures Gallery remains free, as it always has done. We're extraordinarily grateful to Sir John Black for his support for the Treasures Gallery. And as you can see, the visitors to the gallery there, we ask all our visitors at this time, for necessary reasons, to wear a face mask when you go around our gallery. In fact, we're limiting the numbers who can go around at any one time, which actually makes sure that the experience is much more safe and secure, to give you time and space to look around the objects in person. So thank you again for your time and for attending today's lecture. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Harriet, and together we're going to endeavour to answer as many of your questions as possible. So Harriet.
Good evening. Oh, thank you, Julian. That was a fascinating talk, a really delightful introduction just to some of the collection items we have on display in our Treasures Gallery. So for some of the audience who maybe haven't been to the Treasures Gallery before, I highly recommend that you come and visit us soon. We do have a few questions, so I'll fire with the first one from David. Back in February of this year, and perhaps still on now, it was great to see the section of contemporary artist books by women within the Art of the Book section. Are there plans to show contemporary artist books more regularly?
Hi David, that's a really great question. Well, those artist books are still on display in the gallery, and indeed all my colleagues who work on our exhibitions team are so excited to be able to put them on display. They're fascinating objects. So I should have shown you a slide tonight, but they are in different formats and different shapes. Some of them are in forms of concertinas. They're made of different types of materials. They're all extraordinarily vivid and colourful. And again, as you pointed out, they're all incredibly by women artists, and they have been such a great success that I can't give you an absolute guarantee that there will always be that high number of artist books on display in future. But I would say that we've learned a lot from putting them on display, and you know, I would be very keen to continue that offering because they're absolutely fascinating and I love to see them. So I'm glad you saw them, and please come back and see them again.
Fantastic. Yes, we do actually get, we do take a survey from visitors to our exhibitions. So as an organisation, we're quite receptive to feedback from our visitors. So, you know, every time you do go to the library, do feel free to tell a member of staff or let us know that you've thoroughly enjoyed an exhibition or display, because that really helps us shape our programme going ahead. Fantastic. So I'll fire away with the next one. Francesca asks, the treasures display are rotated right. If so, what does this depend on? Just the need to keep the display fresh, or is there a strategy behind the rotation?
Okay, another good question. So it is actually true that all the items in the Treasures Gallery are subject to rotation. And that's actually quite different to other major museums and galleries. I've been doing a little bit of work surveying what other museums, institutions do. Often they put out objects and they remain there in perpetuity. So for example, the Science Museum's new medicine gallery displays are expected to remain in situ for 20 years, or at least that was the intention last November. Of course, there's been some major medical news that's happened since then. At the British Library, of course, we have a significantly high number of books on display and also manuscripts, and they are susceptible to light. So our conservators advise that in most cases they can only stay out for a few months at a time. So some of our key manuscripts like Beowulf or Magna Carta or the Lindisfarne Gospels will be out for a period of up to 18 months, maybe rotating the pages at given times, and then we have a period of rest. But the fact is, we do have 200 million collection items to go on display. Science Museum has 2 million. National Gallery has 1,500. So we have a larger number to choose from. Fantastic.
Thank you, Julian. Francesca also says she loves the treasures. From an anonymous attendee, with so many wonderful items, how do you decide which counts as a treasure?
That's a lovely question as well. There's been a lot of internal debate at the library about what we put on display. From my own personal point of view, and what I know works really well with the exhibitions that I've worked on, I really like to put on display items which have both visual impact, but also behind which there's a really important story that you can tell others to something that they might not have learned or might not have known about that particular item before. And so when they leave the gallery, they can go away and tell their friends about it. And if they learn just one new fact, or they've encountered one item that they haven't seen in the flesh before, that's a really good outcome for me. We are aware that some of our collections don't display as well as others. So, for example, we don't have many newspapers on display. They're very friable. Really, they don't display very well. But with new digital technology, we hope to be able to display more of those. Hopefully, in the future, there'll be more of our contemporary archives on display. But treasure is often quite subjective. But I'm a curator of medieval manuscripts, and literary manuscripts, so things like Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf and medieval manuscripts and chronicles are really my thing. They don't have to have pretty pictures, but if there's a really good story behind them, I think that's a really best way. I really think exhibitions are there to engage and entertain, but primarily to educate people at the same time.
Fantastic. I agree with you as well about the story element. I think that was quite important to me when I came to the library, to kind of truly embody that there's so many stories in our collection. So it's really important to rotate the collection items to be able to share everyone's story that we've got in our collection. We've got a lovely question from Jocelyn. What would you say are the library's priorities in terms of augmenting the existing collection? And is this pursued by the library, or do you wait to be approached with relevant material?
Yeah, hi Jocelyn. Well, of course, there's a bit of both really. The library does have a significant acquisitions policy when we're talking about unique collection items. And by unique, I mean things like manuscripts and archives, and also rare printed books, and even some of those artist books, which are often published or produced in very small numbers. So we do have an active acquisitions policy. We're looking particularly for things that are of national significance, that complement our collections. We also look for items which have a real research significance. So they might complement things that we currently hold, or they might fill gaps in our collections. And we have a series of criteria by which we judge new acquisitions. So my colleagues who work on our contemporary archives, I do know for a fact that they often, over a period of years, they are negotiating with the holders, with the authors themselves, to suggest that the British Library might become the best home for their archive and for their manuscripts in future years. And we do, of course, look to auctions for when manuscripts become available. We are sometimes approached indirectly or directly by the owners of particular items if we like to acquire them. Yes, we do, of course, get offered things that not necessarily belong with the national collection, but we always endeavour to try and find a good home for them. So I might often direct people to the local record office or to another library which really specialises in a particular kind of material. I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julian. So another question, was the Codex owned privately by Joseph Stalin? And if so, did he collect other manuscripts? And what happened to the collection? That's from Susie.
Hi, Susie. No, Joseph Stalin didn't own it personally, but of course it was almost treated as his personal possession. There is a long story behind the history of Codex Sinaiticus, but at one period it had been bought by the Tsar of Russia, and after that it had ended up in the hands of the Soviet Union. And it was given Stalin's blessing to be sold to the British nation. It came at a time when the Russians were really in need of hard currency. And of course, there's such a fundamental witness to the Christian religion. It was really a very important acquisition for the British Museum Library, as then was. And a few years ago, in 2006, 2007, the British Library did collaborate with our friends in St. Petersburg and Sinai and in Leipzig, and we put all the different pages of a manuscript online in a major international collaborative projects. So you can see it all today, and that's a really good example of how a British Library does work with other international partners across the world.
Fantastic. A question from R. Benjamin. To what extent are the treasure room items digitally connected with related treasures at the British Library and other libraries in the UK and abroad? Sort of following on your point.
Yeah, so that's a really nice question. So we do endeavour, when anything goes out in the Treasures Gallery, we really hope that we can find a digital surrogate that people can view. So that's people who go to our reading rooms, but also people who view our manuscripts online. And we're doing a piece of work at the very moment to actually enhance and augment our Treasures online offerings. So we do have a number of items which you can view currently on our Treasures online space at the library. And as a manuscripts curator, we do actively continue to digitise our manuscripts. Only last week, we announced that the medieval and early modern manuscripts team has digitised up to 600 of our early modern manuscripts. That's partly through our grant and aid funding, but also through our philanthropic support. And we are gradually putting those online after they've been conserved and digitised for all our researchers. So we do really like to put on display our manuscripts and our other printed items in digital form so that you can go and look at them again afterwards. You don't just have to physically see them in the gallery itself. And that in turn means that you can often see equivalent copies or related items which are held in other institutions that may be in the United Kingdom or in other libraries and museums across the world.
Fantastic. I think we've probably got time for just maybe one or two more questions, Julian. I hope you don't mind. One actually from me. You mentioned earlier in your presentation something that really surprised me. I know I'm still relatively new at the organisation, but you said that in our collection we have over 700 languages and formats. So I wondered, in your research and your work, what has been the most surprising or unique language that you've come across?
Okay, I can answer that in a couple of ways. So when I first came to the library, I was responsible for cataloguing manuscripts in the collection of Sir Robert Cotton. Cotton is a very important person in the history of the British Library. He owned the 2 copies of Magna Carta, he owned the Lindisfarne Gospels and Beowulf. Cotton acquired manuscripts from a range of people from not just Britain but across Europe and North Africa, so that are manuscripts in his collection in Arabic and in Turkish and in Chinese and in Hebrew. One of my favourite manuscripts in that collection is actually written in Inuit. I find that rather fascinating. An early explorer to Greenland and to the tip of North America spoke and with some of the local population and recorded some of the native dialectal forms. So I really like that. And what people also don't know, coming back to the British Isles, we have in our collections one of the earliest manuscripts in the Cornish language.
Oh, amazing.
Cornish is one of the Celtic languages, and this is a manuscript which was written down in the 12th century, but we actually believe that the original version dates from as far back as the 10th century, according to the forms of the words it preserves. And it contains lists of just everyday words, such as the words in Cornish for types of food and types of animal, including the Cornish word for unicorn, which is incorn, which I really like.
That's amazing. Well, I can think of one colleague in particular. He would probably want to look at those items. Fantastic. And final question, if that's okay. Alexandra says, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I think there are 4 copies of Magna Carta. Are they exactly the same, or is there a small difference?
So yes, there is a very slight difference. So there are 4 of the copies of Magna Carta as issued by King John in 1215. So 2 at British Library, 1 at Salisbury, 1 at Lincoln. Only one of them still has the royal seal of King John attached. That's one of the copies at the British Library. Sadly, that's a copy that was damaged by a fire in 1731. Each copy was written by a different scribe. So the handwriting of all of them is different. Why that happened, we suspect, is because at the time Magna Carta was issued, it was necessary for a copy to be sent to every cathedral in England, so it could be read out in public, and there was a necessity to produce as many copies as quickly as possible. So each one is slightly different, and in each version, occasionally the scribes spell the names differently, or in one case, of course, you miss out an entire clause. Rather important. You can go and see the others in Salisbury and in Lincoln, but we always have one of them on display in the Treasures Gallery at the British Library, and anecdotally is one of our most popular items. Open the doors of the library on a normal day, not normal at the moment, but open on a normal day. You can stand in the Magna Carta room at the library, and you can just see streams of people coming from all over the world, coming to see that one specific item.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Thank you so much, Julian. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have. There's maybe 1 or 2 questions that we haven't been able to answer, so we'll endeavour to answer them offline, if that's okay with you, Julian. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great. So just to let the audience know that we have some fantastic resources online, so do explore them at your leisure. There's 2 on the screen, but if there's anything of particular interest, do reach out to us. We're very keen to kind of point you in the right direction, because our resources are a little bit endless online, so we can point you to any particular topic or subject of interest. So do let us know. And yeah, just to say thank you so much again, Julian, fantastic presentation, and thank you to everyone as well for joining us tonight. We really are grateful for your support and interest at this time, and if there's anything in particular you'd like to know, if you've got any questions, do get in touch with the team. It would be a pleasure to help. Thank you so much.